Today, let's embark on a nostalgic journey down memory lane and revisit the vintage supermarkets of yesteryear. Upon entering a grocery store in the 1950s or 60s, the first striking aspect was its modest size. Typical supermarkets of that era spanned only 15,000 to 20,000 square feet, a far cry from today's sprawling 50,000 square foot supercenters. Back then, stores focused solely on selling groceries and dry goods, devoid of the additional services and amenities we've grown accustomed to, such as bank branches, pharmacies, dry cleaners, or coffee shops. However, some stores offered a quaint lunch counter where customers could enjoy a sandwich or a soda. The staff donned uniforms, with men sporting ties and aprons, and women in uniform dresses, lending a professional air to the establishment. After bagging your groceries, the clerk would courteously cart your items to your car, often receiving a small tip as a gesture of gratitude. The overall layout of these vintage supermarkets was not too dissimilar from today's, with dedicated sections for produce, meat, and dairy. While self-checkout wasn't an option, the process of lining up at the checkout lanes to pay would feel comfortably familiar to modern shoppers. Brothers Tom and Al Borman, with extensive grocery experience since the 1920s, opened their first Farmer Jack store in 1966 in Detroit, Michigan. The stores quickly became a favorite among shoppers and spread across southeastern Michigan. In 1987, Farmer Jack acquired 60 Safeway locations in Utah and southern Idaho in an ill-fated attempt to go nationwide, selling them to Albertsons within a year. Around the same time, a cashier strike in Michigan cost the company millions, marking the beginning of its downfall. By the late 1980s, Farmer Jack was experiencing losses, leading to the sale of its 79 Michigan stores to A&P, with many converted to the Farmer Jack banner. While initially profitable for A&P in the 1990s, the chain failed to adapt to lower-priced competitors like Kroger in the new millennium. Stores began closing, and by 2007, the last Farmer Jack location shuttered. Meanwhile, Big Bear stores were founded in 1933 by Wayne Brown, with the inaugural store opening in Columbus, Ohio. As additional stores followed in the ensuing years, Big Bear made history by becoming the first company to introduce a motorized conveyor belt at the checkout. The chain grew into a major grocery player throughout Ohio and West Virginia. However, competitive pressures in the 1980s prompted Big Bear to experiment with a superstore concept called Big Bear Plus, which combined groceries with general merchandise. In 1988, the company was auctioned off, and efforts were made to save the business by reducing overhead costs and cutting back on employees. Unfortunately, these measures led to a drastic decline in in-store conditions, which did not go unnoticed by customers. The chain never recovered from this setback and eventually struggled to pay suppliers. By 2004, the final chapter closed with the shuttering of the last Big Bear store. Another bygone grocery chain was Dominics, which had a major presence in the Chicago metropolitan area for nearly a century. Founded in 1918 by Dominick DeMatteo, the chain started as a single store on Chicago's west side. Over the decades, Dominics expanded steadily throughout the region, growing to over 100 locations by the late 20th century. In 1998, seeking to establish a foothold in the lucrative Chicago market, Californian supermarket giant Safeway acquired Dominics for $1.2 billion. Under Safeway's ownership, the chain unveiled a new marketing campaign and store remodeling program aimed at appealing to more affluent shoppers. However, Dominics struggled to gain ground against fierce local competition from rivals like Jewel Osco. The chain was also hampered by high labor costs associated with its unionized workforce. Despite efforts to turn the business around, Dominics continued grappling with declining sales and market share losses throughout the 2000s. Finally, in 2013, Safeway announced plans to exit the Chicago market after 15 years of ownership, stating that it had been unable to achieve long-term profitability for the Dominics chain. This marked the beginning of the end for the venerable grocery brand. Over the following year, All 72 remaining Dominics locations were systematically closed or sold off to other supermarket operators, like Jewel-Osco, Mariano's, and Tony's Fresh Market. Another prominent regional chain was Eagle Food Centers, which had a strong presence across Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Born in the Quad Cities area, Eagle underwent multiple mergers and acquisitions, resulting in various name changes, although the Eagle moniker was often retained. At its peak, the chain boasted over 130 locations. In 1989, Eagle Food Centers went public, and a few years later, its long-serving CEO, Pat Petiti, retired after a 35-year career with the company. Shortly thereafter, Eagle began to face challenges, reporting a net loss of $1.5 million in 1999, which was attributed to increased competition. This led to a gradual decline, with stores closing one by one. By 2003, Eagle ceased all operations and closed its remaining stores. However, the Eagle name lives on in a couple of Eagle Country Market stores still operating. Pathmark stood as one of the preeminent grocery store chains in the northeastern United States from the 1970s through the 2000s. Its origins can be traced back to the 1960s in New Jersey, when a group of grocers broke away from their parent company, Wake Fern Foods, which owned ShopRite. By 1969, Pathmark had already expanded to 81 locations, with business thriving. In the early 1980s, the chain had risen to become the 10th largest supermarket chain in the country, boasting nearly $3 billion in sales. This was the era of the supercenter, and Pathmark began exploring larger and larger store formats, a move that ultimately led to substantial debt accumulation. As the company entered the 1990s, it found itself actively seeking a buyer, though it would not be until 2007 that A&P finally acquired Pathmark. A&P attempted to breathe new life into the brand by introducing fresh concepts, but the company was struggling to manage its own debt burden. In 2015, after having filed for bankruptcy twice, the curtain fell on Pathmark. However, the brand has experienced a modest resurgence in recent years. The Pathmark naming rights were purchased, and one store has reopened under the Pathmark banner in Brooklyn, New York, offering a glimmer of hope for the chain's revival. Thanks for taking that nostalgic journey down grocery memory lane with me. I hope revisiting the rise and fall of these iconic supermarket chains like Food Fair, Big Bear, Farmer Jack, Eagle Food Centers, Pathmark, Red Owl, and the ill-fated Dominics was an entertaining trip through retail history. If you enjoyed this stroll through vintage grocery storytelling, show your support by giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing. While the grocery landscape is always evolving, with mom and pops and regional players constantly being disrupted by national giants, it's fun to reminisce about these faded banners that loomed large in their heyday. Who knows? Maybe we'll see one of these nostalgic names attempt a retro revival in the years ahead.